Good morning and welcome to Orlando. Thank you. This is the first time we have brought all of our executives together from all parts of the world. But we didn't do it just to get acquainted with General Motors. Today, General Motors is in the process of an unprecedented transformation from a company with a dominant American personality and focus that just happened to do business in other places into a truly global organization. The transformation is far from complete, and we need to accelerate it. That is why we are here. The future of this great enterprise is in our hands, everyone here in this room. We, the global leadership of General Motors, have an obligation to ourselves and to all the fine men and women we represent, including customers and communities as well as employees, to ensure that the future is one of progress and growth. That is an awesome responsibility. To appreciate its real magnitude, we need to understand how we got to be what we are today. Our character, as well as our business strengths and weaknesses, have been molded by our past. So before turning to the current business priorities, let's take a look at where we came from and where we have been. In the earliest years, the focus and action were centered in the United States.
In the earliest days of the 20th century, William Crapo Durant, the world's largest carriage maker, saw what few others could, that America was destined to fall in love with the automobile.
He wanted to own a lot of makes, so he could always be sure to have some popular cars to sell. Billy Durant Associate.
From his base in Flint, Michigan, the question for Durant was always, which automobile? There were plenty to choose from. Between 1902 and 1907, the number of significant automobile manufacturers in the United States alone grew from 12 to 44. Billy Durant's idea was simple: create the first automotive conglomerate. By 1907, he already owned a controlling interest in Buick. In fact, he had built Buick into the most successful manufacturer in the country. And he had an agreement to buy the Olds Works in Lansing, Michigan. So on September 16, 1908, Billy Durant incorporated the General Motors Company, which would later become the General Motors Corporation. Over the next 2 years, Durant went on an inspired buying spree, to say the least, purchasing no less than 25 different companies for GM. These included major automotive brands that live on today. But they also included key suppliers, companies that provided everything from transmissions, wheels, axles, engine castings, springs, spark plugs, and on and on. And so was born the concept of vertical integration in the auto industry. With so much talent and so many resources, the young General Motors Company also began to develop important technical innovations. These included the industry's first practical electric self-starter, invented by Charles Boss Kettering, who also founded the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, later called Delco.
Hand cranking was difficult and dangerous, and best left to men. But a car that started itself changed everything. an early car owner.
Installed for the first time on Cadillac's 1912 models, Kettering's self-starter doubled Cadillac's sales in a single year and changed the automobile forever.
The seeds were planted for future innovations by General Motors that would affect the rest of the industry and many other businesses. But Billy Durant allowed the various acquisitions to run independently from one another. In fact, General Motors did not even have a central bookkeeping system. So it is not surprising that by the time the company confronted financial disaster in 1920, Billy Durant had lost the trust of his bankers, his major stockholders, and key members of the board of directors. The leadership of General Motors would pass to a man with a very different vision of how to make the company successful in the marketplace.
The man eventually put in charge after Billy Durant's final departure was Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., who had been president of Hyatt Roller Bearing, one of the companies Durant had acquired along the way. And his business philosophy could not have differed more from Durant's.
Mr. Durant had been able to operate the corporation in his own way, as the saying goes, by the seat of his pants. He tried to carry everything in his head, and when some thought flashed through his mind, he would act on it, rarely troubling to consult with the man who had the real responsibility. Alfred P. Sloan, Jr.
Even before Durant's ouster, Alfred Sloan had drafted a report that proposed a completely new management system.
It grouped divisions according to their activities and proposed a highly empowered executive in charge of each. It provided for advisory staffs and a financial staff. It distinguished policy from administration of policy, and it expressed the concept of decentralized operations and responsibilities with coordinated control.
And so was born what Peter Drucker called the concept of the corporation. Although Sloan saw himself mainly as a manager, his vision as a marketer was to have even greater impact.
The quickest way to profit is to serve the customer in ways the customer wants to be served.
And the best way to serve the customer was to offer what Sloan called a car for every purse and purpose. That one phrase described General Motors' product philosophy. It called for the company to produce a line of cars in each price class, from lowest to highest, consistent with good volume opportunity, without major gaps between price steps, and without duplication among products. By staying in tune with the customer, GM and its brands would move along a path of unparalleled innovation. Technical innovations, such as Duco satin finish enamel paints that instantly made Henry Ford's any color so long as it's black Model T obsolete. Styling innovations, like the trend-setting 1927 LaSalle, designed by the legendary Harley Earl, the industry's first full-time stylist. And business innovations like GMAC, established because banks of the time frowned on extending credit for what they called pleasure cars. By 1925, 3 out of every 4 cars in the U.S. were being sold on the installment plan.
The automotive industry would never be in the position that it is today if time financing had not been available.
By 1928, on the eve of the Great Depression, GM accounted for 1 of every 3 new cars in the U.S., total revenue of $1.5 billion, and a 30% return on net assets.
30% return on net assets. How would you like to have a 30% RONA today? Well, that's a stretch goal. That really is a stretch goal. We're going to do it. GM was setting the standard for the industry in all areas, management and finance, as well as product innovation and marketing. Apart from creating the concepts of brand marketing and retail finance for the auto industry, we also created the concept of production scheduling. But our real strength was customer focus. Unlike Henry Ford and others, Sloan and his team realized that when people bought a car, they took personal pride in it. They saw their cars as a reflection of their own personality and aspirations, not just as a functional transportation machine. This understanding of customer desires was to be the core of all General Motors' competitive strengths. And by the end of the 1920s, the action was not limited to the United States.
General Motors was thinking of international markets long before it became fashionable. As early as 1907, Billy Durant had contracted to provide Buick engines and powertrains to the R.S. McLaughlin Carriage Company of Oshawa, Ontario. And he gained controlling interest in Bedford Motors Limited, the company's first European acquisition, in 1909. But the major impetus for overseas operations occurred in 1911 with the creation of GM export operations to handle overseas sales. Most exports were fully assembled vehicles built in the U.S. After World War I, tariffs were rising in Europe, which made export of assembled vehicles very expensive. So in 1920, GM began to evaluate overseas assembly of cars from U.S.-built components. Between 1923 and 1928 alone, GM opened 19 assembly plants in 15 countries. International assembly paved the way for international manufacture. Initially, GM considered buying Austin, England's largest car company, but Austin built small cars. William Knudsen, who was president of Chevrolet at the time and happened to be very tall, expressed concerns about the fit between GM and Austin. His concerns hinted at a kind of American provincialism that would later be a challenge to true global integration.
Everything is bigger in the United States. Railway cars, streetcars. When anyone sits down, he stretches his legs. And a motor car that doesn't accommodate that isn't going to get very far in the United States. William Knudsen.
Instead of Austin, in 1925, General Motors acquired another UK-based manufacturer, Vauxhall, a smaller company, but one which built bigger and more prestigious cars. In 1929, GM established a solid base for expanded continental operations by purchasing Adam Opel AG, a company older than General Motors, whose roots went back to sewing machines and bicycles. Opel's role was clearly spelled out.
It is not intended to make any changes to the Adam Opel AG product range, since this is well matched in every detail to the German market's needs. The Opel traditions, which have been maintained with such success for many generations, will enable us to continue serving the German car owner and the national economy in the same worthwhile manner as before. Geheimrat Wilhelm von Opel.
As GM expanded geographically, it spelled out its international operating objectives in the 1929 annual report, which stated that GM intended to make itself
a local institution in each of the countries in which it operates, rather than a foreign concern doing business in that country. We intend to recognize the customs of the country and harmonize the corporation's procedures and policies with those customs, employing native personnel so far as possible and adapting products to the local tastes. Alfred P. Sloan, Jr.
Within the next several years, GM production and marketing activities spread throughout the world. These included the purchase of Holden's in Australia in 1931, and the creation of GM do Brasil in 1925 and GM de Mexico in 1935. But sweeping changes were still ahead for GM and the industry.
From the very beginning, GM's approach to international markets was to have an assembly or manufacturing presence in the major markets, and at the very least, a marketing presence in emerging markets. But the units in each country were pretty much left to run on their own, each doing their own thing, partly because of geographical distance and limited communications technology, but also partly because management saw no need for them to be integrated. But in the late 1920s and 1930s, the United States was still the primary focus.
On the eve of the Great Depression, General Motors was one of the most successful companies in the U.S., building more than a third of all the cars and light trucks made in North America. During the 1930s, GM continued a program of expansion and acquisition as other companies foundered. In fact, GM actually gained more than 10 points of U.S. market share. But the Depression took its toll. In the U.S. alone, industry sales dropped from 1.4 million vehicles in 1929 to just over 500,000 in 1932. For GM, declining sales weren't the only big problem in the 30s. Tensions between the company and organized labor were coming to a head. On December 28, 1936, the famous Flint sit-down strike began. The conflict would set the tone of U.S. labor management relations for years to come.
It was the biggest, most significant labor war of the last decade. It lasted 44 days and cost 4.5 million man-hours of work. Fortune magazine reporter, March 1939.
With neither side willing to yield, it took federal intervention, including direct pressure by President Roosevelt to put an end to the strike. Despite the Depression and labor problems, GM continued to set the standards for the rest of the industry. GM's research laboratories produced a stunning list of innovations, including the two-cycle diesel, the first one-piece all-steel roof, the first fully automatic transmission, independent front-wheel suspension, no draft ventilation, and on and on. There were business and marketing innovations as well. For example, under Buck Weaver, GM's customer research department became the world's largest, devoted to
Finding out what people like and doing more of it. And finding out what people don't like and doing less of it. Henry Grady Buck Weaver.
That research had a direct effect on vehicle development, triggering refinements like lower centers of gravity, column-mounted gear shifts, and door locks on both front doors. Such customer focus and innovation allowed GM to close out the 30s on a high note. By 1941, sales had hit a record of nearly 2 million vehicles, more than 46% of the U.S. industry. And for the 24 million people who toured GM's Futurama exhibit at the 1939 World's Fair, the future looked even brighter.
By the end of the 1930s, GM's brands and products had become synonymous with the kind of lifestyle Americans longed for. We were such a symbol of progress that the equivalent of nearly 20% of the U.S. population visited that GM World's Fair pavilion just to see our technology and our product exhibits. Imagine that today, if you can. It would come to around 53 million people. But as we also saw on the screen, employee relations were not one of the areas of progress. We have worked hard to replace adversity and mistrust with understanding and candor in relationships with our employees, not just unions, but we still have a long way to go. And the competitive challenges are greater than ever. With World War II, car production came to a virtual halt. But after the war, GM would continue to set the pace for the industry as Americans returned to the showrooms.
What a thrill to take the wheel of a rocket Oldsmobile.
More than ever, Americans wanted cars that made a statement about their lifestyles and aspirations.
Even during the Depression, attempts to sell stripped-down, low-cost new cars to compete with the Masters and the Deluxes made little headway. There's been little chance of offering a low-cost people's car. We already have one. It's called a used car. Automobile Manufacturers Association, 1945.
Beginning in the 1950s, the new national highway system increased America's appetite for bigger, more powerful cars. And GM was giving consumers what they wanted, more powerful vehicles, through technology like Chevrolet's newest V8 engine, which delivered new power for accessories and previously unimagined performance. GM was the performance, styling, and volume leader of the U.S. industry. What GM built was largely what the customer of the 50s bought. As one reporter wrote of GM of that time,
"It was an institution apart. It was so big, so rich, and so powerful that it was regarded as more than a mere corporation. It was like a nation unto itself." David Halberstam, the 50s.
Make a date today to see the USA. See it in your Chevrolet.
GM at first continued to concentrate on the large cars that had always been its bread and butter. The annual model changeover was a major marketing and production strategy, with each division launching a new vehicle, a major change, or a significant minor change every year. GM was the epitome of efficient mass production, with some plants and stamping presses designed to make 1 million or more units of a given part or vehicle model each year. Few GM executives at the time envisioned that kind of small car volume. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, GM managed to beat back the small car phenomenon by adding its own small car platforms. The imports at this time also had lower quality, but they would be back. Although few executives realized it at the time, these additional platforms would eventually dilute GM's economies of scale, bring confusion to the product lineup, and force the end of the annual model changeover. And at the same time, GM was also importing Vauxhalls and Opels designed for European markets and tastes. As the company continued to grow in the 1950s and 1960s, its corporate culture became rigid, hierarchical, and inwardly focused. As one employee put it, every department in GM seemed to be run by people
who believe that the world is bordered on the east by Lake Huron and on the west by Lake Michigan. Zora Arkas Dontov, Chevrolet engineer.
In addition, internal competition and the proliferation of platforms began to blur Sloan's original philosophy of a car for every purse and purpose. Car divisions began building more and more models that covered more of the price ladder. As the number of platforms proliferated, the traditional annual changeover for every car finally fell by the wayside. Brand identities were starting to blur, and there was more direct competition between GM brands and divisions. For example, Chevrolet was competing in a price range once reserved for Buick, and vice versa. Yet, even as the differences between divisions blurred, Competition between them continued to grow.
The 1950s have been called GM's glory years in the U.S. market. We continue to set the industry standard for styling and innovation. But product proliferation was already adding cost and blurring the brands. And opportunities beyond North America were still seen as a secondary priority.
At the end of World War II, the costs of rebuilding an infrastructure and a market in Europe and Japan appeared staggering. Vauxhall's manufacturing operations were not severely damaged, but Opel's were. And in 1945, Opel's Brandenburg truck plant was confiscated and moved to Moscow. GM proceeded to rebuild Opel only at the urging of the U.S. government. And all foreign automakers were prohibited from re-entering Japan. The European market actually recovered quicker than most people had expected in the early 1950s, and so did Opel and Vauxhall. But GM's experience in those Asian and Pacific markets that it re-entered was to be a different story. By the mid-1970s, a combination of financial losses, non-competitive product, and restrictive government policies had forced the company out of most major Asian and Pacific markets except Australia. Even in Australia, GM's market share fell drastically in the 1970s as the Japanese became the dominating player in the Asia-Pacific region. And the U.S. itself remained at the center of the company's own worldview.
The difference between transnationals and multinationals is the difference between a globe and a map. The globe is a continuous whole. A map has a definite center, which is the home market and the headquarters. Multinationals make decisions to benefit the center. Henry Wendt in Global Embrace.
In Europe, GM, a true multinational, tried to impose U.S. styling on European tastes in the immediate post-war years, and it was a near disaster. But GM learned from such design mistakes. By the 1960s, Opel and Vauxhall were concentrating on relatively smaller cars designed specifically for European tastes. The 1970s were difficult economic times for the United Kingdom and Vauxhall. Ironically, Bedford was a dominant force in international truck markets in the 1950s and 1960s, but quickly lost its leadership to the Japanese competitors in the 1970s. But Opel continued to run well despite the impact of a stronger Deutschmark. The first real steps toward integration of the two companies came in the early 1980s in response to new competitive challenges throughout Europe. The first front-wheel drive Astra, designed and engineered by Opel, was introduced in the UK as the twin of the new Kadett under the Vauxhall nameplate. And in 1981, the Vauxhall and Opel marketing organizations in the UK were combined, with all dealers selling both brands. Also in the early 1980s, Vauxhall car design and engineering functions were moved to Opel. And in 1986, Vauxhall stopped manufacturing Bedford trucks. But through the mid-1980s, Opel and Vauxhall each still had completely separate manufacturing operations and still viewed themselves largely as unrelated independent entities rather than sister companies.
There's a strong feeling today that Opel is first a German company, second a multinational, and third a subsidiary of a U.S. company. Alex Cunningham, Opel General Manager.
The tradition of completely independent operations finally started to change with the creation of GM Europe in 1986. The charter of the new coordinating organization was clear: to develop a unified strategy for growth and cost management, a strategy that focused on all of Europe rather than on individual countries, on leveraging brands and eliminating competing platforms, on a single team rather than departments and fiefdoms. And it worked. GME's earnings rose, while Ford, which had outperformed GM in Europe in the 1970s, began to slide. In Asia, GM had established a partnership with Isuzu in the 1970s, which would later grow to 38% equity participation in the company. Isuzu was a source for small cars and trucks to be sold in North America. GM would also begin sourcing small cars from Suzuki for sale in North America. And in the early 1980s, GM established a relationship with Toyota to apply its production methods in the U.S. By 1990, the Isuzu partnership would be operating joint ventures in Egypt, England, Australia, and the Philippines. Today, Isuzu is a key player in GM's global truck platform strategies and is the sole center of expertise for diesel engines and commercial vehicles.
In North America, the industry was undergoing a sea change in the 1970s and 80s, while we were still operating the same as we had in the 50s and 60s. It was easy, maybe even natural, to miss or ignore the changes that were developing around us. Because we were so successful, because the bulk of our sales and profits was still in the United States, and because cheap gasoline and a new national highway system allowed Americans to continue their love affair with large cars, which were GM's strength, there was little concern for changing our approach in any area of the business.
My dinner companion, a Japanese government economist, began by outlining a stage-by-stage strategy to become world competitive in industries like steel, ships, cars, computers, semiconductors. And after that, I asked, after that, he said, we will invent new technology instead of simply copying yours. Very ambitious, I said. But how can you beat giants like General Motors and Texas Instruments? They are, of course, very good companies, he said, but they are too complacent. We will invest more, and eventually we will win. Conversation reported by Ira Magaziner and Mark Patinkin in The Silent War.
On the surface, GM was still moving ahead in the early 1970s. Sales revenues also were on the rise to $113 billion by 1973. But net income had been in decline from its all-time high in 1965. And under pressure from growing import competition in the U.S., profit margins had been in even steeper decline since 1966. And return on net assets had been eroding steadily since the early 1950s. At the same time, a new era of government regulation was compounding GM's product development process and costs. When the 1973 oil embargo was imposed on the U.S., GM had the poorest corporate average fuel economy in the industry and was ill-prepared for the complete collapse of high-profit big car sales. Still, the giant company responded with an agility that surprised many. It added the word downsizing to the dictionary, reducing the wheelbases of all luxury, full-size, and intermediate cars by 1978. And it proceeded with development of two new small cars, a new family car, the X-Body, to be introduced in 1979, and the J car, to be launched in 1981. But by now, the Japanese were setting the standard and the pace for the rest of the industry, as GM had in the 1930s. Their product development cycle was faster and simpler, as were their manufacturing processes.
By the late 1960s, the Japanese firms on average had gained an enormous advantage over mass producers elsewhere and were able to boost their share of world motor vehicle production steadily by exporting from their highly focused production complexes in Japan. James P. Womack, Daniel T. Jones, and Daniel Roos in The Machine That Changed the World.
GM had also failed to keep pace with Japan's tremendous commitment to quality. To some, GM even seemed to be ignoring the voice of the customer when it came to quality. And GM couldn't plan for the low dollar-yen exchange rate that made Japanese products so affordable in the US. Those four factors, a short product development cycle, lean manufacturing, good quality, and a weak yen, combined to give the Japanese an awesome advantage in the 70s and 80s. The emphasis at General Motors was still on mass production rather than on lean, flexible production techniques. By comparison,
Toyota's flexible production system and its ability to reduce production engineering costs let the company supply the variety that buyers wanted. GM has focused on one basic product in each plant. By contrast, the Japanese transplants all build 2 or 3 products. James P. Womack, Daniel T. Jones, and Daniel Roos in The Machine That Changed the World.
GM's one major attempt to change its processes and systems in response to the challenges whirling around it was a reorganization of North American operations in 1984. But the new BOC-CPC structure actually created 2 huge new organizations that were not common in any way, and were actually even more complex than the old organization in many areas, especially engineering and manufacturing. Ironically, the large Fisher Body organization, which had done one of the best jobs in adopting common processes throughout all of its units, was dissolved. In the meantime, GM's products and brand identities had become even more blurred. As a result,
it was obvious to buyers by the mid-1980s that a mid-sized Buick Century, for example, was little more than a higher-priced Chevrolet Celebrity. Doran P. Levin, in Irreconcilable Differences.
GM paid a stiff price for that lack of brand identity. By the close of 1989, the company's share of the new car market hit a post-Depression low.
Alfred Sloan's original structure had outlived its day, but the 1984 BOC-CPC reorganization was so traumatic that we failed to attempt further change until the board of directors demanded action, just as major shareholders and members of a different board had demanded action 72 years earlier when Billy Durant made his final exit. The reason for firm action in both situations was that the company suddenly found itself on the brink of financial disaster. And the lesson today is that we cannot afford the luxury of complacency, let alone arrogance. By the way, if you didn't see much attention given to several specific units and brands, it's not because they don't have an important place in our history. The intent of this presentation was to focus on how the corporation grew and then stumbled, and the lessons that apply today. With that brief historical review as a preface, I now want to offer a few observations on where we are going. Up to now, the focus in North America has been mainly on restructuring and financial turnaround in our vehicle and component operations. Outside North America, the focus has been on more market share in established markets and entry into emerging markets. Today, we are at the next stage, the same stage that Sloan and his team were at in the 1920s, when they had established momentum and they had to decide what kind of a company they wanted General Motors to be and what it would stand for. What kind of a company do we want General Motors to be? Our vision statement says we want to be the world's leader in transportation products and related services. But how do we get there? Above all else, we must operate as a single, unified global team. As I said earlier, in today's small world, that is the only way to leverage our unmatched resources and talents and make the vision a reality. To be the world leader, we also need to stand for more than the sum of our brands and products. Can we do it? I believe we can. We have the talent and resources to get there. Now it is a matter of how we focus and apply those talents and resources. Everything this team has accomplished in the 1990s shows that we can do it once we come together as a united and focused team. We still have a long way to go in fulfilling our vision, of course, and the dangers of complacency are one of the strongest lessons in our history. When I visit GM plants and offices around the world, I see very bright and energetic people, people who are proud of themselves and proud to be part of General Motors, people who want General Motors to succeed. But I also see people who don't understand the urgency of getting more competitive, who don't understand where the company is going or why, and who don't understand where the company's priorities fit with what they see as the priorities of their own unit. As leaders, we have a responsibility to ensure that every single member of the team understands where GM is moving and why, and where his or her own work priorities fit with the broader priorities. The most urgent message to take back to the rest of the team is our immediate business priorities. There are 4 of them. They all came through one way or another in what you saw on the screen. They apply to all business units. They all reinforce one another, and they all must be executed across the board in all the units, no excuses. You'll spend a lot of time on them today and tomorrow, and then at your own sector's separate follow-up meetings on Thursday. Let's run through them briefly. The first priority is to run common. That is to have common vehicle components as well as common business processes and systems. We have never really run common, as you saw this morning, and we are still paying dearly for it. Duplicate or redundant components, processes, and systems have made our structural costs higher than the competition's, and they have also made us less flexible and slower in adapting to market shifts. This is no longer acceptable, not if we want to win and grow, regardless of each unit's historical identity and self-image. The second priority is to think lean and run fast. That is, cut costs and add value in all areas of the value chain, not only in our own operations, but in those of our suppliers and our dealers. The third priority is to compete on a global basis. That is, compete as a single global enterprise rather than have different units operating independently in different regions as we did for so many years. We have made progress in moving from a country-by-country view of the world to a regional view, but we now need to take that next major leap of a global view. This means global vehicle brands as well as platforms and powertrains, and it means aggressive expansion into emerging markets beyond North America and Western Europe. We have done a good job in establishing a manufacturing and marketing presence in the emerging markets in just the past few years, and we are making good progress in developing global vehicle platforms and powertrains. It is difficult, but we cannot afford to slip in these vital areas. Global platforms and powertrains are especially crucial for our future in the small car business, where the competition is tough and profitability is even tougher. The biggest growth in emerging markets will be in small cars. We need to be the company that comes up with innovative small car platforms that are adaptable, affordable, and profitable around the world. NAO and GMIO must work closer than ever in developing these platforms. Again, we are making progress, and we still have some growing pains. It's not simple for so many different units from so many parts of the world to come together as a team after all the history and separation that you saw on the screen. But we need to move even faster, as you will hear this afternoon. The fourth priority is growth in all business sectors. This is one where we really need to stretch our creativity, leverage our strengths, and scheme the business. We need to look at General Motors as a total system. As I said earlier, a system that is more powerful than the sum of all its parts. We need to do what we did in the 1930s again, be the best company in anticipating, shaping, and adapting to changing technology and changing customer desires. Again, our vision is to be the world leader in transportation products and related services. But the definition of those words themselves will change as technology and customers' desires continue to change. Creating growth may mean thinking of the business itself in a completely new light, which is what Alfred Sloan did in his day. We need to think of growth in three dimensions. First, geographical expansion in the emerging markets, which is the focus of GMIO, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, which will have the highest growth of all. Last year, we accounted for just 4.6% of the total market in this region. We have set an aggressive target of 10% for the year 2005. Second, new market segments, which represent a tremendous opportunity for NAO. And third, new business at the downstream end of the vehicle process and ownership cycle. The OnStar communication system is just one example of downstream opportunity. In the components business, the Delphi team must stay focused on growing its non-GM business at the same time it works as a major partner with NAO and GMIO. Not too many years ago, our component operations were considered a millstone around our neck. Many respected analysts and experts thought we could never get competitive and should get out of the business entirely. Today, the Delphi team has turned that so-called millstone into a competitive advantage for all of General Motors. And the pending integration of Delco Electronics with the Delphi team will make Delphi an even stronger force in producing and delivering smart parts and smart systems. All of Delphi's customers respect and value the team's technical ability, innovation, and customer focus. I know that there has been a lot of speculation about Delphi's future role in General Motors, and this has caused some tension. Let me assure you, Delphi will remain a full partner with its NAO and GMIO customers. I want to emphasize that growth in Delphi's non-GM business does not mean in any way that the Delphi team will work less closely or energetically with its GM customers. On the contrary, as Delphi grows and becomes a more powerful competitor, it will be able to serve its GM customers even more effectively. Indeed, Alfred Sloan always expected the component operations to do about 50% of their business outside GM. So we are, in a sense, returning to a strategy that worked well in our past. And the Delphi team's expertise will play a critical role in our continuing quest for product innovation. Again, it is in our hands. General Motors has always had creative, capable, hardworking, loyal employees in all operations, in all countries where we compete. But companies don't fall behind the competition because employees decide not to work hard. They fall behind because their leadership falls behind, because leadership fails to set the right course and keep the rest of the team focused on that course. The video we saw this morning only begins to touch on the richness of our history. It is above all a human history, a living history, full of irony, passion, triumph, and even tragedy, as well as many business lessons. A philosopher once said that those who fail to understand the past are destined to repeat it. So what will the future historians say about us as leaders? Will they conclude that we came together as a single, unified global team, that we leveraged all of GM's strengths as a total system and achieved our vision? Or will they conclude that we repeated or failed to resolve the shortcomings of the past? Those are some of the questions to think about as we move into our work sessions today and tomorrow. Finally, what we need above all else, as you have heard me say on a few other occasions, are deeds, not words. We are not here in Orlando just to listen to each other's words. Rather, we are here to transform the words into fast action plans and then deeds. Together, I know we can do it, and we will do it. I know we will come together as the industry's most unified, innovative, customer-focused, and forward-looking global enterprise. I know we will make our vision a reality. Now let's get to it. Thank you.